All right, we are good to go. The session is up. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to introduce Gal Biran, the CEO and co-founder, who's going to speak to us about connecting B2B communities. I'm sorry, of Crowdvocate. Yes, CEO and co-founder of Crowdvocate, right? All right,
yep.
Yes. Who is going to be speaking to us about connecting B2B communities to customer journey and advocacy to implement ROI. And I personally am really curious to understand what is behind this title and how we do it, because I love ROI. So Gal, take it away. I am there behind the scenes if you need me. If not, I will be back 5 minutes before our session ends. You know how to work the controls to get questions from the audience. So enjoy the session, and Gal, take it away.
Thank you. So hi, everybody. Great to have you on this session. And what we'll do is we'll review different ways that companies can engage their communities beyond support, right? We'll talk about the premise of communities and then how you grow them. My professionalism is around B2B communities, less so consumer, just to kind of put that into place. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about why to have a B2B community, right? What's the logic and the value in that? What is the bigger picture? You know, if you think about customer communities and communications, where does that all fall into? Why do some communities fail? Probably a lot of sessions touch that, but I'll try to share what I know and have seen. And also, of course, what we see works. And then really the second half is really, you know, the part of connecting communities to the customer experience, to the journey, and connecting communities into advocacy and revenue. So that way you could really measure ROI. And we'll have Q&A at the end, and we can also have Q&A in the middle. So feel free to post questions in the Q&A, and hopefully I'll see them and be able to answer every now and again. Okay, let's begin. So first of all, why have a B2B community in the first place? I'll start with the end in mind. So that's at the bottom here from a research by Michigan University. But basically, companies can see almost 20% increase in revenue and incremental revenue from customers who've joined the community. And I'm sure during these sessions these days, you might have heard different stats, and they're all good and right. At the end of the day, we can show statistically that by having engaged communities, you grow the share of wallet, you grow revenue from those customers. But let's break it down a bit. So there are communities for, of course, self-service, and that there, what you want to do is you want to save money on support, right? You want to give better and faster service, so you increase satisfaction. That's reason number two. You want to have user-generated content, on the one hand, to reduce your support. I will also talk on the other hand of creating advocacy and a lot of other topics. Then you want to identify who might be an advocate within your community, okay? The way to do that is to see those people who are active, who are solving for others, who are engaged. They might also participate in other activities. They're already contributors. Let's see what else they can contribute in, right? Communities also help you increase engagement and stickiness, and we talked about, you know, how that can help with the overall revenue and also retention. Then you have just generating more value to your customers, whether it is knowledge, whether it is some kind of social positioning, perhaps with leaderboards, and also in peer-to-peer kind of relationships. And then you can generate demand generation from communities. Some communities, if they're open and public, Google ranks them. People come and see what's happening in your community, and you might capture, if you know how to create it correctly, you can capture demand generation for communities as well. Then you want to connect your employees to your customers in B2B. So you want to have people from different teams answering questions in the community, reading feedback in the community, connecting your company, your employees to your customers. Of course, product feedback and audience research. And at the end of the day, solve for, having higher retention with your customers, higher growth. A lot of reasons. When you read all this, you say, hey, it's a no-brainer. Let's have a B2B community. Later on, we'll come to the point of, that some of them fail, quite a lot, actually. And what happens today is really that most of the B2B communities are very focused on the service side of the house. They are very focused on the self-service, on kind of the faster service, user-generated content for support, so users helping other users to answer questions, a piece of engagement, a piece of knowledge, a piece of product feedback, stuff like that. They're touching a lot of things, but the core premise is saving on cost and providing better technical service. And many times they're owned by customer success or technical service because of that. And we'll talk about that as well. But let's go up for a moment. Let's think like a company, like the CEO. When you go up kind of and look at it, basically there's a lot of ways to engage your customers, right? Community is a mean of engagement. It actually is a mean of digital engagement. COVID times, everything is digital engagement, but COVID's time will pass. And at the end of the day, it's part of the digital engagement and your customer experience at scale. It's part of what you do when you want to do kind of one-to-many. But there are other digital engagements, and there are other instances of customer experience, and ideally you want to tie them all together. So there's customer marketing and communications, right? There are different customer programs. I'll give you an example. Beta group, that's a customer program. How do we tie the community to the beta group? That makes some sense. Some people say, yeah, those people who gave a lot of ideas in the ideation, maybe we can ask them to join the beta group. Or those who solve a lot of solutions, they're power users, let's put them in the beta group. But what about other customer programs? Customer advisory board, reference pool for sales references, review sites, going and writing reviews in G2 and other, Trust Radius, Capterra, whatnot, Gartner, sending people to reviews, and many other programs, right? Then you have product, right? Product is a digital engagement. If you're a SaaS company, that's one of your main engagements as a SaaS company. How do you tie the community to the product, or where does it sit with all of that? Of course, your website. And there are additional journey touch points, whether it's sending an NPS survey, having a user forum, webinar, whatnot, right? So community leaders should start thinking, I think, in our experience, my recommendation, kind of bottom down, and not necessarily, starts from up, downstream, and not necessarily bottom up. So but today, most of the community leaders are kind of focused on the support elements, on a place for customers to log in and have a user forum, maybe also open and close tickets, some chat, support site, and a knowledge base. That's your basic every B2B community. But the vision we're going to talk about today, and the way to empower communities to be more ROI driven, to be more advocacy driven, to assist with retention, is blowing them up to be much more valuable and much more influential in the customer journey. So from a support community, if you will, to a customer community, that's a very big difference, right? If it's your customers community, okay, you have user forums. Maybe you had those in the support community as well. But in a customer community, some of the user forums have nothing to do with the product and support. So let's say I am a company in the marketing space, which we are. For example, my support community or my user forum, would be more honed towards how can I do better marketing? Not about the product, how do I turn the color of the button from blue to red, or how do I configure this, or how do I solve that? About my role, about my job. How do I do my job better? If you're a community manager, you probably want to have a user forum that talks about being a better community manager, right? Tips and tricks for community managers, etc. You don't just want discussions around how do I solve a problem with the product? Or how do I configure XYZ? Same thing with education. If it's a customer community and not just a support community, education has to be broader. Talk about different use cases. Talk about how people who are your customers can grow their professionalism and even grow their position, elevate their game, help them be, transcend in their career. Feedback. So if it's a customer community, the feedback is not just about the product. The feedback can be about the service. The feedback can be about whatever, the website. The feedback can be about an event you participated in, right? If that's the way they communicate, why not everything there, right? Support, again, that comes back to the key of support. That's great. Demand generation, we talked a little bit about that. So demand generation, again, if it's a customer community, make at least some of it, if not the most of it, public. And then Google will rank it higher, and then more people will visit and see what's happening there. Non-customers will want to see how they solve things and make sure that, and how active is your community. And the first step is just seeing that and saying, okay, this is a vibrant community, this is a vibrant brand, I want to work, I think it's a good product to choose when I'm a prospect, when I'm a lead. The next thing, now we tie it to ROI, is maybe having ways to identify visitors who are not customers. And if you identify that it's a visitor who's not a customer, at a certain point in their journey in our community, you can say, hey, we've noticed you're a visitor. We know that you're not yet a customer. Let's talk, right? Why not do that in the community and generate leads, generate ROI? Connecting employees. So again, it's one of the greatest assets of companies would be that their employees really dig their customers and vice versa. So they are connected, they understand each other. The product team understands what customer says, and the support team understands what customer says. And even finance understands what customer says about your pricing model or whatnot, or your, I don't know. So doing that, when it's a customer community, not just a support community, suddenly you can tell finance, hey guys, in the customer community, we actually created an area for feedback about our pricing, about our payment methodology, about whatnot. And somebody from finance needs to sit there and answer the question. And somebody from finance needs to iterate back if there's new ideas or new thoughts of how we can do our better serve our customers around financing, right? And payments and whatnot. And I'm giving examples who, just to kind of ignite the mind. Then you have a collaboration and networking and peer support. And again, open it up. If it's a customer community and not just a support community, then you can have the user groups there, right? And they could even meet when there's no pandemic. And all the people in whatever, Paris, can meet because they're all using your product. That's a user group. But the community could foster that and help that and be that digital engagement before and after the user group. Have your academy with different use cases and best practices. I'll show that. Surveys and ideation, of course. So again, not just about support, but about so many other things around your company, your messaging, your product, and whatnot. Advocacy, maturity of your customers, their intent to buy. We talked about that a bit. And all the types of response. So, the move from support community to customer community really needs to take in all the different aspects of engaging customers and understand that your community is probably your core engagement mechanism with your customers aside to your product once they become customers. Before they become customers, your website is their core engagement mechanism. That's when they are prospects. That's where marketing talks to them in different ways. After they become customers, they less and less visit your website. Product and community, that's going to be the two places that are going to engage mostly in their journey, in their experience. So before we dig into how to make it great, let's talk about what kind of, makes it not so great. And again, sure, many sessions in these days have talked about this, and I might not be, sharing a lot of news here, but first of all, communities fail. In B2B, quite a few of them, more than 50%. Why do they fail? So it begins with what we began with, lack of strategic planning and vision and understanding the business objectives. When it's just a support community, when it's not tied to your overall business objectives, when you don't understand what your brand is all about, when you don't understand what your customer expects in their engagement beyond solving for a support issue, when you don't align your community objectives with what the management expects to get out of it and how much he's willing to invest in it, that's a big potential for failure. Then you have just failing in launching, right? Maybe the process was too long. Maybe you didn't allocate the right budgets, and suddenly you don't have enough people to do whatever they need to do, whether it's around design or whatever, I don't know, answering customers, whatnot. Staffing, technology, procurement, all those things, right? Then there's lack of executive sponsorship, and that ties directly to the first point. If you don't get aligned with your executives, you're going to have a problem with aligning on objectives. You're going to have issues with budget. You're going to have issues with sponsorship whenever there's a problem, right? So you need to have that alignment. And then within that alignment, you need to find a champion, a sponsor that would always be there, even when things are not going that well. And even when there are budget cuts. I see sometimes, not sometimes, now in COVID, quite a few community managers were laid off in B2B. That's crazy in my perspective. How would a company lay off somebody that is managing and leading their engagement with their customers in a time where they have to even engage more with their customers digitally? That tells me one thing. That community, those leaders, didn't necessarily align with the executive team, with the management on the same objectives. They didn't agree on the KPIs. They didn't show ROI because they didn't explain why they are the best fit to actually handle COVID through the community and help customers retain and help customers still get answers and be happy, although this crazy time. And by the way, it's nothing to say about those managers. I'm sure they're great. It's just, connecting to the right points of decision within your company. Because it's hard when the times, are hard, when shit hits the fan. That's when you have to have aligned objectives and sponsorship, executive sponsorship. Failure to get traction. That's classic. Companies launch communities and, it only engages with a very small percent of their audience. I've heard this, kind of 1, 9, and 90. So basically 1% are hyperly engaged, 9% are slightly engaged, and then 90% are kind of the visitors, the viewers. They never, write anything. So you need to convey that message to management, and also you need to see how do you maybe change that a bit, or can you create meaningful relationships with those 1 and 9%, and how do you show the influence that you're doing on the 90%, etc. Then there's lack of resources. I'm sure quite a few community managers can relate to this. You need to have a full-time employee plus whatever, depends on your size of your community or whatnot. It has to be a dedicated job, a dedicated focus, a dedicated role. No pathway to build peer relationships. Remember, it has to be about value to your customers. It has to be about something that they feel connected to. Peer relationships, look at Facebook. I mean, that's the glue, right? So if you want stickiness, if you want people to stay, even in B2B, you need that peer relationship to be a very strong element. Missing clear value to the user, what's in it for them. And then we have, again, not enough clear KPIs, key performance indicators. What are you measuring? Why is it important? No SLA, service level agreement, on how you're answering. I'll give an example from HubSpot because they actually do have an SLA. If customers, bring up ideas in ideation or have maybe some issues, HubSpot has a whole mechanism of making sure that they respond at a certain time, that they actually tell the customer that their idea was accepted or rejected. That's telling customers, listen, this is not, if you write things here that are valuable, we're going to put time into listening and we're going to answer. And then, not listening to the voice of customer and not really collaborate, and not finding ways to basically generate advocacy from the community to show more ROI. So how can you do it better? How can you avoid that failure kind of mechanism? So we talked about the aligning with executive, defining the KPIs. I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to move now slowly to more tactical elements within that. So first of all, let's talk about a few keys for success. Your community really has to be everything post-sale, right? We said we touched it over here. I mean, it has to move from being just a support forum. It has to be, products and services and ideas and academy, and it has to have much more than that. Advocacy and other things. It has to be a hub for everything. And I'll show in a minute one of the examples for this. But community has to start adding a lot of touch points. You want people to do user groups. They can get there from there, right? Anything that a user would want to do, a customer would want to do post-sale once they're a customer, their community should be their new home. Instead of going to the website, go to the community, right? The new home. Then there has to be, also specifications, specific topics based on geographies and stuff like that. You have to have leaders within the community, of course. Customer tiers, so stuff like gated islands, this already starts to go to how you connect that to the journey and to advocacy. If you create groups, if you create VIP groups, if you create areas within your community for C-level, we always hear people talking about, but how do I get C-level involvement, right? Maybe you can find a way to create a forum. Let's say you have a CAB, a customer advisory board, and you give them an area in your community to also engage just themselves. They don't go through the whole community. They don't have to do any other stuff. People can't necessarily connect them, but they can engage over there and see value from that, right? Or if you have, again, country-based, language-based. So all of those things help people feel more connected to the community. And when they're more connected to the community, the next step would be engaging them in a more proactive way and turning them into advocates. I'll talk about that soon. Then you have different types of programs. Well, you could find mentors within your community who can mentor. So think of somebody who's active, right? Customer, a power user, knows your product amazing and loves you. Why not tell him, hey, we have a mentor program. You could help novices. You could basically help people who've just onboarded to our product better use. And it's not just about support. Again, it's more about the use case. It's more about how do I build, okay, let's take the HubSpot example. How should I structure my CRM with HubSpot? Not about the technical, why don't you make this person an owner? Why don't you click this and do that? But what is the right methodology of doing that? You turn champions into mentors. Everybody wins. Mentors and mentees get relationships. You have more customers onboarding the right way. Champions build their brand, build their social influence. You could also, of course, give them something for that. Then you have, in communities, you have to measure for success KPIs and ROI. It has to be ROI driven. I can't understand communities that are not related to ROI at all. And we'll talk how you do that. And you have to understand that they have to be dynamic and changing. Think in that sense, communities in B2B have to be the same as consumers, B2C. Dynamic, changing, pretty, can't be kind of old school. So let's start talking about some examples and go into advocacy. I'll make a stop in about 5 to 10 minutes to see if there's any questions from the audience before I dive deep into advocacy and ROI. So first of all, one of the greatest B2B communities out there is Salesforce community, the Trailblazers. Massive, massive, massive community in B2B scales. And they did start from, a lot of issues around support and self-serve. And that's great, but they evolved, they matured. And today they have over, 1,500 groups. And they have, they see that people in the community, for example, and that's how they tie it to ROI. They see that there's, lower attribute, like 3x lower attribution, but there's more, double the bigger deals, and there's 2x more pipeline and 30% higher adoption. So being in the community hits a lot of criteria that help you maintain your customers, grow how much they pay you, the share of wallet, upsell, expand, whatever, and generate more adoption. And basically, yes, they might save a lot of money from support, right? They measured and they saw that they can save $2 million monthly from support by a lot of questions and tickets and stuff that they close. And that's great. That's one of the ways to show ROI. That's your classic support community, and you should measure that. But then you should go beyond. And going beyond, this is another great community from Alteryx. You can see here, look at that. They have, the hub, but they have an academy. They have discussions, knowledge, ideas, blogs in the community, user groups here, right? Alteryx for Good, use cases, programs, and support. All of the things that a customer might look for are here. And use cases, think of that, a use case library for your customer. It's not about technical support. It's a whole different game. It's about how can they, use your product in other ways, right? So let's start moving into the advocacy realm. So there's the classic communities, and we talked about best practices around those. But then, and the KPIs around that would be engagement and, how many people are active members and how many people are group leaders maybe, and page views and questions that are answered and how fast they're answered, and cost saving. That's maybe the main thing around support, if you could, and measuring that, right? Now let's talk about advocacy KPIs, because for advocacy KPIs, we want to know what we generated from that user that can help us generate new business, right? That's the bottom line here. So we don't just want user-generated content for solving support issues. We want user-generated content like quotes, like customer stories, like video testimonials that helps us bring new customers in our marketing efforts, right? We don't want just peer-to-peer relationships in the community where they help each other. We want them to leverage their relationships and refer others into the brand. Create lead generation by referral programs within your community. We want new advocates, people who've said, I want to participate in more than just the community. I want to participate in more programs, be more proactive with your brand. That's what advocates are. I've been a contributor in the community. That's awesome. Now I also want to be an advocate and contribute to the brand. That's the difference. That's where the line goes, right? Then you want people, for example, who can join your reference pool for sales reference calls or whatnot, and user reviews and much more. There's a very long list. But the idea here is that when you move from community support engagement KPIs to advocacy KPIs, you're starting to look at how can you generate more from this individual user and from the entire customer account through the community. Before I go on, maybe I'll stop here and just see if there are any questions. Hopefully I can understand how I see the questions here. I don't think I see questions, so I'll move on for now. But if the moderator sees questions and want to jump in, you could help me with that, of course. Okay. So let's take a few more examples. Let's look at D2L, for example. They're in the education space. Again, I'm just talking B2B right now. So what have they done? First of all, they designated experiences for key audiences, right? They split their community between instructors, administrators, developers, 3 different audiences, different content, different discussions, a whole different, it's persona-based, right? That's how you start building that very, very specific experience. And then you can generate advocacy from each one of these audiences. We want advocates who are instructors, we want advocates who are administrators, and we want advocates who are developers, because each one of them has their own ecosystem that we want them to refer to us, that we want them to share stuff on social so others see and come, that we want them to write a story or a quote or a review, and for people like them, for that content to resonate. That's why it's important those personas don't just stop by the topics inside the community, they also go further to the topics outside the community. And these are just more actually community examples of, how companies brand their communities as a bigger effort around their whole customer world, right? A public knowledge for anything about QuickBase, that's, for QuickBase, or Jamf is like, the largest Apple IT management community in the world. These are, companies who basically say it's not limited to our customers. We've opened it. We want as many people in here. We want to create a lot of content. It has to be semi-support, semi-marketing. That's how it has to look to be great. Okay, so let's start talking about then engaging the next level of advocacy. So the way to do that is really think about, how can I tie advocacy into my community? How can I create activities that are specifically oriented about advocacy in my community? So the first step actually would be data, would be insight, would be understanding your customer's journey. And I'll skip here and come back. So understanding that this person now in the community is Joe or Lisa. You should know that from single sign-on, right? And you should tie that Joe or Lisa to who they are in your CRM, right? So basically knowing, hey, and they're from company ABC. And we know also that they've already been with us for a year or been with us for a month. Those are two very different journeys. They've been with a certain feature for a year, or they've been with us for a year, but they're now onboarding a new feature, a new version, and they're in that journey only for 1 month. Again, two different stories, two different engagements. You want to know if they're active in the community or not so active in the community, right? If they're contributors or, just listeners, if you will. But you also want to know how that relates to other activities they do. Remember that big digital journey that they have, but are they visiting your blog and reading content? Are they participating in user groups, in virtual events, in webinars? How active are they in your product, right? Are they power users? And then you want to start connecting the dots. And I'll give some examples. So if somebody is a power user in your product, but not even logged into your community, and that can happen, you want to be able inside the product to bring them into the community, right? Okay. Or maybe that person is a power user in the product, but passive in the community. You want to be able in the community to say, hey, we know that you know much more. We want to turn you into a contributor and into an advocate. Let's see how we do that, right? And the idea here is to understand their journey, map their journey inside the community and outside the community, and also understand their timeline as a customer, their install, what are they doing as a customer, their industry and whatnot. Really have a very, very robust profile of that user in the community, because then you target them in the community for things that resonate with them, even if it's not related to the specific community journey. So for example, if somebody is now in the community, right, but in their journey, they should now, for example, have a product tour video, you could show that up. You could basically, inside the community, and I'm jumping here a bit, but pop up and say, hey, Joe, you've missed out on your product tour video. Why don't you take it here, for example, right? And if somebody is in that journey where actually you want them now to, they've finished onboarding, they're using your products for 6 months, you send them an NPS, they're even happy, right? But now they're in the community, you want to ask them if they're also happy with the community, if they have ideas on how to improve it. But then you want to say, hey, why don't you go write a review on G2 or on Gartner, because it looks like, you can appreciate our product. Be super contextual to their journey overall. Make the community the place they engage, but take triggers and data from other sources to understand what to engage them about in that specific moment, right? So those are some examples. And again, whether it's a welcome message, this is, an example community, in this case, Lithium or Chorus, doesn't really matter, the type of the community. You could basically pop up on top of the community, create messaging as an overlay, as an add-on on top of the community, asking people for different activities that are relevant to their journey. First of all, you make the community engagement more interactive, more interesting, but you also have them doing actions that are relevant for them at that place and that time, while they're in the community, taking those actions, basically growing their experience. We're talking about customer experience, growing their experience with the community, and little by little generating advocacy, right? So these are some examples. The next step would be, imagine that inside the community, you could start putting elements. Okay, you have badges for community leaders, for people who provide solutions and do that. What about advocacy badges? What about customer badges? So start putting into the community elements and badges that are not related to community stuff. They spoke in an event. They provided a customer story. They lead a user group. They're in your mentor program. What about all of those, right? Start giving them more acknowledgement for more activities that are not community related, that are experience oriented, advocacy oriented. Having ability to do rewards inside your community. So putting stuff like, gift cards, swag, free access to your annual event, free service hours or training courses or certifications, whatever, charity. It doesn't really matter what it is, but being able to reward within the community journey, being able to engage a bit differently in the community. So not having those, no offense, but discussion forums, lines after lines, start having more pictures, videos, colors, right? Think consumer, think engagement, think interactive inside the community. And some people would now shake their head and say, holy cows, this is a community support. We can't, make it, pop art. We can't start, doing marketing in our community. That's crazy. Customers would leave us. You're wrong. Customers are consumers. And they, especially now when they work from home, the same person sitting in the same home desk doing his work 2 minutes later or 2 minutes, before was a consumer buying something somewhere else, right? They are regular to those experiences. These domains are emerging, and kind of converging together, and they expect a higher elevated and proactive experience from you as well. Then basically, when we talk about this journey, you can also tie it to revenue. So for example, the community can be a place where you push them towards upsell. Again, imagine a journey that a customer, and that a customer has product A. And that customer is a bank, and they maybe also need product B. So in the community, you could basically show up and say, hey, it's great that you're a contributor and a power user on product A. We think you might be interested in looking at the discussion about product B, right? And maybe, by the way, look at the video about how product B helps product A in banks just like you. So now what have we done? We take somebody that we know that is active in the community in his own product and a contributor. We tell him, why don't you look at the other stream, at other contributors in this community and other topics they're talking about with another feature. And we educate them through the community and through their journey there to get interest, to get intent, what we call, to another feature, and then hopefully upsell that feature. And then you can show management ROI, because you can then start tagging all those interactions. How many referrals came from the community? How many leads came from the community? How many upsell opportunities came from the community? And so on and so forth. So these are some examples of how you start looking at the customer's journey to understand their activity beyond community, right? To basically say, hey, they provided a referral, they shared a success story, they provided, a review. Maybe we can track how many people came from that review, right? Maybe we can see how many people read that customer story and success story. Maybe we can see how many deals or opportunities in our CRM used Lily as a reference and helped them close that deal, and that's revenue influenced. So now we're showing how we took people who were contributors in our community and started engaging them for advocacy, got them to join our mentor group, got them to join our customer advisory board, but also got them to provide a customer story and speak on stage and write a review and take reference calls with new prospects just like them. And think about it, maybe that prospect came to your community They saw that person as a contributor in the community. They loved that. Now imagine that. They're talking to sales, and sales tell them, hey, that great contributor, he can now get on the phone and talk to you about why you should move to this product. What an amazing experience is that for the prospect, and probably a great experience for your contributor, because he or she are going to say, when they start talking to the prospect is going to say, man, I saw you in the community. That's amazing. You write so many answers, and you're a superstar there. I love it, right? That's a great experience for both. And that's an experience that's most likely going to lead to a sale. And you can then, what we call, attribute part of that revenue to the community, to the ROI. I want to stop for a minute and see if there are any questions here. Hopefully I can understand how I work this out. Okay, so I think this is Q&A. But I don't think this is it. I think that's a different discussion.
Hey, so here.
Ethical.
You need to move one icon to the left. That's right. That's the in-session chat, and those are the questions being posted.
Aha. Okay. So do I have? I don't see a question though. I don't see a question, but thank you, Danny and John and all the other people. So I'll go back to share my screen, or and let me see if there's somebody who wants to ask a question live, right? I do it Q&A. Which platform do you recommend for B2B community? I'm not sure that I'm the expert on that, so I don't really want to answer that one. There are many great platforms, right? Whether it's, Higher Logic, Vanilla, Chorus, Salesforce. And I'm sure that I just forgot 20 others that are great. So, I mean, I think, there's, you could reach out to me and I can connect you to people who are better experts than me on community platforms. Okay, so let's continue talking about how we turn communities into advocacy communities and generate revenue and ROI. Right, so now basically what we can do is we can start looking at that income, if you will. And the way we would do that is really when we get somebody to say, yes, I'm willing to participate in a customer story, we need to find a mechanism to capture that in the community. And again, there's a few ways to do that. You could do that with types of chat. You could do that with Crowdvocate. You might have mechanisms in your own community to just ask them if they're willing to do that. That's great. That's the first step. The second step is collaborating with the right people in your marketing organization, right? To basically capture that, to basically say, hey, we just got a person in the community that said that they're willing to give a customer story. Connect the two of them, right? Then don't forget about it. You have to find a mechanism to keep monitoring it, ideally in your CRM, right? Because the community is not the place to monitor that. So in your CRM, find a mechanism to monitor and say, Joe was brought from the community to provide a customer story. Now, if Salesforce can somehow tell us that that customer story was public, and if marketing automation, for example, HubSpot, Marketo, whatnot, can somehow tell us that a lot of people looked at that customer story, and we can somehow measure how many of those people that looked at that customer story became leads and eventually customers, we can draw a simple line saying, Joe was a contributor in the community, provided a customer story. That story was viewed by 100 people. 50 became leads, so we influenced 50 leads. 10 became customers, so we influenced 10 customers. Those 10 customers generated $1 million, so we influenced $1 million, right? Now, that's not magic. You do that with marketing automation, you do that with customer marketing automation or attribution, whatever, but there are ways to do that. But the idea here is that you need to start thinking as community manager that way. You need to come to an agreement with your sales ops and marketing ops and customer marketing team and whatnot that you want to have a mechanism to start measuring the advocacy generated in the community and its influence on the business, right? So that's one way to do it. Another way is, of course, to create an engagement report. I think most community do that. When you look, you compare all the people in the community, right, and their accounts or their companies, again, B2B, all the companies that are in the community, and those companies' revenue and how it grew. So let's say you compare companies not in the community or not active in the community versus companies active in the community. Is there a difference? Ideally, you want to show that companies active in the community are also paying you more, buying more products, retaining more, whatever, but show positive income generated from the fact that they're community members. And again, most community leaders do that, I believe. The next step is, right, basically being able to map, like I mentioned, that individual's post-sale journey beyond the community. You want to be able to get data, right? This is now going into the data level, into the analytics level, basically saying, we want to know not just what happens in the community. We probably know everything great inside the community, but that's a silo, right? That's only one place that customers engage us. We want to be able to understand what they're doing in the product. We want to know, maybe they can bring in more users from their company into the community, right? How many users do they have in that company? We want to know which products are they, using, so we know which streams we can use them for. So being able to connect the user's journey, the company's journey to the community, and then campaign, and I'm using the word campaign because, again, at the end of the day, this is a bit about marketing to them based on their journeys. So campaign to them different messaging based on that. Inside the community, tell them, like we mentioned earlier, why don't you look at another feature that we think is really relevant for you? Or why don't you become a mentor and help others grow? Or why don't you lead your local user group, et cetera, et cetera. So doing that, you could do that just based on community metrics, but you're missing out on a lot, and that's the gap. If you start leveraging product metrics, CRM metrics, marketing metrics, then you could really know who's this user that you're looking at and how much more can you do with him or her. So that's why it's so important, right? Then the next step would be basically to create cohorts, to create, bunches of campaigns that meet bunches of experiences, because you can't really target 100,000 or 500,000 users, or even 80,000 or 5,000 users in your community. So what you want to do is you want to start saying, okay, this person is a power user in the product. He's also a contributor in our community. We think we can turn him to these three things, maybe ideation, maybe beta group, and I don't know, maybe whatever, have sessions with product teams. And that's the best path for him and for us. And if we do that, we want to measure how many ideas or how many sessions with product he participated in, and did those lead into a new feature? And if they did lead to a new feature, did that feature generate new revenue? And again, now we tie activity in community, targeting community people, to ROI and to impact on the revenue and on the company. Advocacy is another stream. So you have a bucket, a cohort of people that you see, these people are very loud. They speak a lot in the community. They are social influencers, right? Maybe there are also social influencers outside on LinkedIn, Twitter, whatnot. If you know that, you could start tying and saying, okay, we want you to join maybe a social influencer program, a thought leadership program, and start speaking about us outside the community, not only inside the community. And maybe those people are going to, be not so active in the community, right? Maybe they don't want to solve problems in the community. They're less technical, but they're still with a very high profile in the social networks. You still want them to join the social amplification kind of stream. So being able to identify them and then put them into buckets, into cohorts, and give them, activities that maximize their potential, but you could also measure their influence on revenue. Another example would be what we call a reference pool. So taking people who are active in the community and who you have, again, other data about them, that they're with your company for a certain amount of time and whatnot, and asking them, can you join our reference pool? It's a very simple question to ask. Nobody in the community is going to leave your community because you ask them, can you join our reference pool? And if you make the ask more contextual, something in the lines of, hi, Lisa, we see that you're active in our community. Thanks a lot. We love that. Because you're in the manufacturing industry, we thought you would be really impactful in our reference program for other manufacturers. Are you willing to join our reference pool? What do you think? Will Lisa say yes or no to that? Stats are that Lisa would say yes 90% of the time, because it's contextual to her journey, because it's relevant to her profile and industry, because she's in the community in the first place because she wants to learn and contribute. So if she can talk to customers as part of their sales process, to new prospects, she can learn and contribute over there as well. Okay? And then you can, again, measure in CRM how many people from the community joined the reference pool. How many reference calls have they provided? How many of those reference calls turned into closed-won deals? So those are the ways to engage customers inside the community for advocacy, and then measure the revenue out of that. And really, the idea here is to think outside the community box. Tie all the other engagement to understand your users on the one hand, and also be able to engage them beyond the classic forums and community buckets inside the community. Like we mentioned earlier, engage them with maybe pop-ups, engage them with a whole area, right, for advocates, something like this, a zone where they can do things inside the community because they're in the advocate program. And look at them from a much wider perspective of, not just how much of a champion they are as inside the community, but also how much they're contributing, understanding, for example, their NPS and their product and, all that stuff, so we can understand how much they contribute in other places and how we can measure their influence and revenue. Other questions or other thoughts about this? I think I see something in the feed, but again, not sure about that. Right. Yeah. The question about which platform do I recommend? That's kind of the way to turn community participants into advocates, and then measure the ROI of advocacy. And again, these are some examples where you can basically see how many referrals were provided in the community, how many of those closed won, how much revenue we generated. It's a simple math, right? But you need to be able to capture those referrals, send them to Salesforce, tag the fact that they came from the community, and then report the fact that these referrals closed won, the community helped generate this revenue. That's kind of, what it's all about in short. I think basically with that, I came to the end of my session. And from my point of view, if there are questions that people want to ask live or anything like that, I'm happy to do that. And if not, you all just gained another half an hour.
That's great. I think that while we wait for any questions that there might be, I have some of my own. So if you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. But while you were speaking, so much tremendous information, a few things came to mind. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, speaking in terms of targeting and revenue and ROI, and I acknowledge that this is very much oriented towards business communities, at least I think so. But there are other communities where the measure is, they're not for business. I don't know if we necessarily define them as a nonprofit, but there's no monetary target. So how would you measure, or what would you measure in a community where profits are not the target? How would you do that?
Right.
And also maybe an add-on question to that is, because the people engaged in the community, and especially admins and moderators and people that have a lot of work to do and aren't compensated for it monetarily, they're like, when you're compensated for it monetarily, okay, it's like quote unquote your job. But when you have a group which is maybe a support group, a nonprofit, or just generally a community which is doesn't have an ROI target, and yet the people driving the community have a lot of, again, quote unquote work to do, how do you measure the success of the community? How do you reward those people who are driving the community if the reward is not monetary?
Right. So I think, first of all, in that sense, again, my expertise is B2B communities, and those are monetary. But if you have, I would say, if you have a nonprofit or you have a community that isn't for profit, or a company that isn't for profit, you need to, again, it goes back to the start, align with your management, with your CEO, with your executive team. What do they expect the community then to generate? Maybe a metric that is important for a nonprofit community is how many more volunteers they can recruit, right? That has money value to it, because the more volunteers they have, the less, the more workforce they can generate. Another one would be how many donators they can influence and recruit. So if you're a nonprofit and those are your two KPIs, volunteers and donators, now you need to kind of rethink your community. How can we influence donators and volunteers? And maybe, again, one of the activities would be referring a friend to the community to become a volunteer. And maybe one of the activities would be thinking of campaigns, asking your community to think of campaigns, of messages, of ideas that are honed towards donators. So you take your community and volunteers who are meeting the people you serve. Okay, let's just say, for the sake of the argument, it's a nonprofit for cancer, right? God forbid. So, I mean, your volunteers see cancer every day, probably. And they understand the story, they understand the pain better than maybe some people working in the organization, right? And then what you want to do is you want to leverage them for stories, for storytelling, for amazing items they can bring in that will help you generate campaigns that help you bring in donators, right? So that's just an example of leveraging your community for advocacy that generates revenue, even if it's not a nonprofit.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, it's true. Not everything is measured in profit. That's very true. Another thing that came to mind, as you're talking about all these various metrics and measuring and all the things, and especially the technology behind it, I wanted to ask you, and maybe it ties in to a certain extent to the question about platform. About how to do it, actually, because if we're a full-blown, let's say, business, and we have the resources to put behind our automation and our systems, and we have a CRM system in place, and we can measure absolutely everything, then that's one thing. But again, I'm thinking also about the communities that take the simplest. It's not necessarily simple, but let's say a Facebook community. There are very, very large Facebook communities. I don't know, for the sake of discussion, we'll just call it CRM for Facebook. Managing so many people. Okay, I manage, for example, a community, a men's community of around 6,000 members. I know there's similar communities in Israel with tens or even hundreds of thousands of members, for example. So when you interact on an ad hoc basis with members, of course, you can do that, and you can solve their problems ad hoc, and you can do these things, but you don't really have that type of view into the user base, if you will, into the customers, into the members of community that you would have if you have, again, let's say, a CRM system. So if you're not a business that puts together a full-blown automation, Salesforce, SAP, whatnot, how do you do it? How do you manage the sheer volume of things that you would like to measure and control, and simply visibility into your user base if you don't have such tools? Or maybe there are such tools. How would you tackle that problem?
Again, I come from a world or a domain where there are tools, right? And you can measure. And if your world is such that you cannot measure, again, if you gave the example of Facebook community, so I think you need to find ways to measure. So again, I'll take the example of asking people to provide stories and quotes that you can use later on your website, just for example, to bring in more people. Okay, let's just take that simple example. So you find a place in your community, even if it's Facebook, you ask people, can you please put in here your quote? Or can you press this link to go to a Google Sheet and write a story, whatever. And you measure how many people, who are the people who gave you those quotes? How many people gave you those quotes? How many of those quotes and stories were then very good and you made them really nice with a picture and you put them on your website, right? Now you have a list of advocates, a list of people who did more than just ask questions in the community. They also provided advocacy. Okay, so you have a list of initial advocates. You also have a list of activities that they did, quotes, stories, I don't know, maybe invited a friend, whatever. And now you can look, for example, again, if you're running like a business that doesn't have measurement metrics, you can ask them, by the way, what made you join the community? When people join, right? And maybe have just a drop-down list of, Facebook can do that, a survey, right? What made you come to the community? And if one of the things that made them come to the community or made them do an action was the quote they saw, the story they read, okay, in your spreadsheet, you put one more line for that activity. And then at the end of the year, you can see how many people provided how many quotes and stories and whatnot of advocacy, and how many lines did you get added in your spreadsheet because of that. And hopefully you will see many lines and you will understand that it's valuable. If you don't see many lines, it's still great that you measure it. You know what? Because now you can stop that activity and invest in something else because it's not helping. But I mean, I think that measurement is key. And again, if you don't have tools, you could measure manually as much possible.
I agree with you. And of course, the saying goes that in God we trust, but all others need to bring data. That's definitely true. I think, well, who knows, maybe there's an opportunity here for Facebook to create another layer of their community management tool. And communities are certainly a very important part of Facebook. I think that they've realized that over the past few years. It used to not be the case. Maybe they'll provide community managers with maybe a CRM for Facebook. Who knows? Any more questions from the audience before we bring it to a close? If not, then Gal, thank you so much for a very informative and very, very interesting talk. It was a pleasure having you here. I'd like to remind the audience that we have the next sessions up at 9:30, our AI as a tool for community building, and also solving business problems, calculating ROI, and telling compelling stories. So with that, we'll close this session, and thank you very much. Gal, I'll end the session now, and that takes us backstage again.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.